The knife was at Lavinia Langley's throat before she could draw a single breath. Not a metaphorical knife. Not the kind of danger that gave a person time to think, to calculate, to reach into the deep well of knowledge she had spent 31 years filling. This was cold steel pressed against warm skin, and the man holding it was speaking in a dialect of Comanche that most frontier interpreters would have mistaken for Kiowa, and the United States Marshal standing 6 feet away had his hand frozen on the grip of his Colt revolver, his jaw locked tight, his eyes burning with something caught between fury and helpless terror. Because Marshal Ezekiel Ralston could not understand a single word being said, he understood the knife. Every man alive understood the knife, but he did not understand that the warrior holding Lavinia was not threatening her life. He was begging her to speak. He was saying, in a dialect that had drifted south along the Red River and mixed with 3 other tongues over 40 years of migration, that his people had been poisoned by water from a creek the soldiers had diverted, that 7 children were sick, that the man the government called their agent had vanished with the winter supply allotment, and that this woman, this pale-haired woman who had come to the reservation boundary 3 times with medicine and flour and no soldiers behind her, was the only person left in the territory that any of his people trusted. He was saying, in a voice cracked with grief and desperation, that he needed her help. And Ezekiel Ralston, the finest lawman between the Cimarron and the Canadian River, was a half-second from shooting the man dead. Lavinia moved her left hand, slowly, deliberately, palm outward, fingers spread. Not toward Ezekiel, toward the warrior. She spoke. And the sound that came out of her mouth made Ezekiel Ralston take his hand completely off his gun and stand absolutely still, not because she had told him to, not because he had suddenly understood the language pouring from her lips, but because in 14 years of riding hard country from Kansas to New Mexico, he had never once heard a white woman speak like that. Fluid, certain, native. Not the broken trading pidgin the army interpreters used, not the gesture-heavy approximations of the sutlers' men who thought they knew the tongue. This was the real thing. The cadences, the tonal shifts, the subtle glottal pauses that changed meaning the way a comma changed a sentence. He watched the warrior's knife hand drop. He watched Lavinia Langley exhale, turn around, and look at him with those steady gray eyes that he had been trying not to think about for the past 3 weeks. "He is not a threat, Marshal," she said in perfectly composed English. "He is a father. And if you will holster that weapon and listen to me for 5 minutes, I believe we may be able to save 7 lives and stop what is shaping up to be a very preventable catastrophe." Ezekiel Ralston holstered his weapon. He had arrived in Haskell County, Texas, in the last weeks of October in 1882 with a federal warrant, a telegraph order from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and a problem he could not solve alone. The problem was named Cyrus Booth, and Cyrus Booth was the Indian agent for the southern Comanche reservation boundary lands, and Cyrus Booth had, by the best evidence Ezekiel had assembled, been systematically stealing the government-appropriated food and medicine allotments for at least 2 years. The people who should have received blankets and grain and beef cattle had received nothing. The people who had tried to complain to the territorial officials had been told the deliveries had been made, and the paperwork confirmed it, because Cyrus Booth was very good at paperwork and very good at bribes. The reason Ezekiel needed a translator was simple and damning. 3 of the 4 men who could speak any version of Comanche in a professional capacity were on Booth's payroll. The 4th had died of influenza in September. The Army interpreter at Fort Griffin was a man named Calhoun who spoke a liturgical version of the language learned from a missionary text published in 1851, which bore approximately the same relationship to the living tongue as a cathedral Latin prayer bore to a Neapolitan fish market argument. The Bureau had told Ezekiel to find his own interpreter. The telegram from the Haskell County Land Office that had eventually reached Ezekiel's temporary base in Abilene had said, in the abbreviated language of the frontier wire, Langley Homestead, 9 miles south of Seymour. Woman speaks every tongue in the territory. Her word is good. He had ridden out expecting an older woman, a widow, perhaps, married to a fur trader or a scout, who had picked up conversational phrases over decades of proximity. What he had found at the end of a well-maintained fence line, surrounded by a kitchen garden that was still producing late-season squash in the October chill, was a woman of about 30 who was calmly repairing a wagon wheel with the focused competence of someone who had done it 100 times and expected to do it 100 more. She had not looked up when he rode in. "Marshal," she had said, still working the wheel, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who had been expecting him. He had pulled up his horse, surprised. "How did you know?" She had glanced up then, briefly, and he had registered the gray eyes and the calm intelligence in them before she returned her attention to the wheel. "You ride like law, back straight, pace deliberate, hand near the iron. Also, Mr. Delacroix at the trading post told me the federal man had come through asking questions about me. That was 4 days ago. I figured you'd eventually follow the directions." She set down her wrench and dusted her hands against her canvas work trousers, then stood and faced him properly. "Lavinia Langley, I assume you need an interpreter." "Ezekiel Ralston," he said, "federal marshal out of the Northern District. And yes, ma'am, I do." "How many languages?" she asked. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. How many languages do you need? Because my rates vary." She said it without humor but without coldness either, in the tone of a woman discussing entirely practical matters. He had stepped down from the horse then because it had seemed right, and he had told her what he needed, and she had listened with the particular quality of attention he would come to recognize over the following weeks as one of her most characteristic traits. She did not half listen while forming her response. She listened until he was completely finished, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke. "I can help you," she said. "But I need you to understand something first, Marshal. If your investigation harms the Comanche people on that reservation boundary more than the problem you are trying to solve, I will withdraw my services. I have a relationship with several bands in this territory built over 8 years of honest dealing. I will not allow that relationship to be used as a weapon against the people who have trusted me." He had stared at her. "You are putting conditions on a federal investigation." "I am telling you my principles," she said without flinching. "You can take them or leave them." He had taken them, not because he had no other choice, though at that moment he nearly did not. He had taken them because in that single exchange, she had told him more about her character than most people revealed in a year, and his instincts, which had kept him alive through 14 years of some very dangerous frontier work, said this was a woman worth listening to. He had made camp that night a 1/4 mile from her property, as propriety required. He had lain awake watching the stars above the Texas plains and thinking about gray eyes and the particular way she had held his gaze without any of the usual feminine deflection he was accustomed to, and he had told himself it was simply professional interest. He had been lying to himself, and he had known it even then. Lavinia Langley had not always lived alone on the Haskell County homestead. She had come to Texas in 1874, 8 years earlier, at the age of 23, with her husband, a botanist named Gerald Langley who had come west to study prairie flora and had brought his young wife along because she was, he had told people, indispensable to his work. What Gerald had meant was that Lavinia was the one who actually spoke to the people who knew the plants, and the people who knew the plants were predominantly the native tribes of the southern plains and the old Mexican ranching families who had been on that land since before Texas was Texas. Gerald had been a capable scientist with a genuine love of botany and a genuine inability to learn languages. Lavinia had the opposite gift. She had grown up in Pennsylvania, the daughter of a professor of classical languages at a small Quaker college. Her father had believed, with the passionate conviction of the self-educated, that language was the fundamental technology of civilization, and that any person of intelligence who failed to pursue linguistic ability was wasting the most essential tool of human connection. He had taught Lavinia Latin and Greek before she was 10. He had introduced her to a Cherokee student at the college when she was 12, and she had attached herself to that young man's patient explanations of his native tongue with an intensity that had alarmed her mother and delighted her father. By the time she was 17, she had a working knowledge of 6 languages and a burning hunger for more. The frontier had fed that hunger like nothing in Pennsylvania could have. Gerald had died of a fever in 1879, 4 years after they had settled on the Haskell County land. He had not been a bad man. He had been kind and somewhat remote and genuinely appreciative of her, in the way that a man appreciates an excellent instrument without quite understanding what makes it excellent. She had grieved him honestly and completely in the 6 months after his death, and then she had done what the Quaker blood in her demanded, which was to look at what was real and practical and move forward. What was real was that she owned 160 acres of decent prairie land under the Homestead Act. What was practical was that she knew how to work it. She knew every family within 30 miles, and she knew the languages of the Comanche bands in the territory well enough to act as an honest intermediary in trade, medicine, and dispute. She had built a life that was solitary but not lonely, self-sufficient but not isolated. She had friends who were Comanche women, Mexican vaquero families, Norwegian homesteaders, former Buffalo soldiers who had mustered out and taken land grants. She had the trust of all of them because she had earned it the hard way, which was by showing up, by being reliable, by never using what people told her against them. And now there was Ezekiel Ralston, sitting on a borrowed chair in her front room 3 days after his arrival, watching her write something in Comanche with a competence that made him quiet in a way she was not yet accustomed to from him. He was not, she had decided, what she had expected from a federal marshal. She had expected bluster. She had encountered enough law in the territory to know that the badge often attracted a certain kind of man, the kind who believed authority resided in volume and intimidation. What she had found instead was a man who asked questions and then listened to the answers, who looked at the evidence she had been quietly gathering about Cyrus Booth's thefts with genuine attention, who swore under his breath when he realized the full scope of what had been taken from people who were already fighting for survival on marginal land with no political recourse, and no one in Washington who cared enough to look. He was also, she acknowledged to herself with the same honesty with which she acknowledged most things, extraordinarily physically present in a way that made her uncomfortably aware of the size of her front room. He was a large man, not in the way of excess, but in the way of a man who had worked hard all his life and whose body showed the evidence of it. He stood perhaps 6'2" in his boots, with shoulders that filled a doorframe and hands that looked capable of doing a great deal of damage, and were, somehow, very careful with her things when he moved through her house. He had dark hair that was past due for cutting and dark eyes that she kept finding on her when she wasn't expecting it, and a jaw that was set in the particular way of a man who was accustomed to being resolved. He had a scar along his left jaw that she had not asked about and he had not explained. She had not asked because it was not her business. She had not explained the photograph of Gerald on the mantelpiece, and he had not asked. They were, in that way, politely careful around each other. The investigation required them to spend a great deal of time in close proximity. They rode together to the reservation boundary, where Lavinia had established contact over years of patient, honest relationship building. She translated not just words but context, which was a different and more complex skill. When the headman named Tassawi spoke about the creek, she did not merely render his words into English. She explained to Ezekiel the cultural weight of water rights in Comanche society, the specific history of that creek, and the series of Army decisions that had diverted it, the way the contamination was being interpreted not merely as a practical disaster, but as a spiritual betrayal. Ezekiel listened to all of it with the focused attention she was coming to associate with him specifically, and he took notes in a small leather-bound book with a stub of pencil. "You write in shorthand," she said, glancing at his book as they rode back. "Picked it up from a court reporter in Wichita," he said. Faster than longhand, he looked at her. "You look surprised." "Most marshals I've encountered don't take notes at all," she said. "Most marshals I've encountered don't convict many people," he said. She smiled before she could stop it. It was a small smile, and she turned it toward the horizon before he could see much of it, but she suspected from the slight change in his posture that he had caught it anyway. The investigation was moving forward, but moving carefully, because Cyrus Booth was not a stupid man. He had connections in the territorial government and in the Bureau of Indian Affairs that meant a frontal assault on his paperwork would fail without ironclad physical evidence. What Ezekiel needed was the location of the stolen goods, the actual physical allotments that had been diverted, which required either a witness who would testify or a paper trail that led somewhere real. What Lavinia had was something she had not yet told him about. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She had told herself she needed to trust him further before she put a source of hers at risk. She had told herself a great many things in the 7 years she had been making decisions alone on this land, and she recognized the voice of her own caution with the wry familiarity of long acquaintance. But she also recognized, sitting across from Ezekiel Ralston in the lamplight of her kitchen, as he spread Booth's forged delivery records across the table, and she watched him work through them with methodical intensity, that this man was trustworthy in the specific way that mattered to her. He was trustworthy because he was angry on the right people's behalf. She had watched enough men in positions of authority to know the difference between performative concern and real fury. The real kind was quieter. It sat in the jaw and the hands. It showed up in the way a person couldn't quite let go of a document that showed them something intolerable had been done. Ezekiel had been staring at one particular delivery manifest for 4 minutes without saying anything, and the set of his mouth said everything about what he intended to do about Cyrus Booth. "I have a source," she said. He looked up. "A woman named Maria Fuentes. She's the wife of one of the vaqueros who worked the Booth property last spring. She told me something in confidence 3 months ago that I didn't know what to do with at the time." Lavinia straightened in her chair. "The Booth Ranch has a secondary barn, half a mile off the main road on land he leases under a different name." She saw it. Boxes and crates, dozens of them, marked with federal stamps. She didn't know what was in them, but she knew they shouldn't be there. Ezekiel set down the manifest. "Why didn't you report this?" he asked. His voice was careful, not accusatory. "To whom?" she said, and she let the full weight of the question sit between them. "To the territorial marshal. He plays cards with Booth every second Sunday. To the land office. Booth's brother-in-law processes the registrations. To the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're the ones who signed off on the delivery confirmations Booth forged." She looked at him steadily. "I was waiting for someone I could actually trust, Marshal, and I needed to see who you were before I decided if you were that person." The silence stretched, and he asked. "You'll do," she said. It was not romantic in the conventional sense. She knew that. But the way his face shifted, the way something in those dark eyes opened slightly, like a man who had been braced against a door and felt it suddenly stop pressing, she thought that perhaps it was something better than conventional. They rode to Maria Fuentes the next morning. Lavinia translated the conversation from Spanish, because Maria was more comfortable speaking Spanish than English, and she watched Ezekiel sit across from the frightened woman with a patience that cost him something. She could see it in his careful stillness, and speak with her in English that Lavinia rendered into the softest and most reassuring register of her Spanish vocabulary. By the end of the conversation, Maria had agreed to guide them to the secondary barn. The barn was there. The crates were there. The federal stamps were there, dated across 18 months, containing grain, dried beef, blankets, medicine, all of it. All of it stolen from people who had gone hungry and cold and sick because one man had decided their suffering was worth a profit. Ezekiel stood in the middle of that barn and was very quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Lavinia and said, "I need a witness list for the arrest. I need people who will testify. Booth has local connections. I need testimony from people who can't be bought or intimidated." She understood what he was asking. He was asking her to use the relationship she had spent 8 years building, the trust she had earned at personal cost, to support a legal process that operated by the rules of a government that had not always treated her sources fairly. "If I ask them," she said slowly, "and the legal process fails them afterward, that damage cannot be undone. I need your word that you will see this through." "You have it," he said, immediately. No hesitation. She had believed him immediately. No hesitation. That night she stayed up past midnight writing letters in 3 languages, Comanche, Spanish, and Norwegian, because there was a Norwegian family who had seen a Booth delivery wagon taking an unexpected route in August and had never been asked about it. She sealed each letter and Ezekiel carried them on his next circuit to the trading post. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm that was not quite professional and not quite personal, and occupied the complicated territory between those things with the same careful attention they both applied to everything else. He ate at her table more nights than not, because the ride back to his camp after dark on unfamiliar country was genuinely impractical, and she had told him so in the direct manner that was becoming both maddening and entirely comfortable to him. She cooked well and plainly. He washed up without being asked. They talked across the table about the case, and then sometimes the case ran out and they talked about other things. He told her he had grown up in Missouri, son of a county sheriff who had taught him to read a landscape and read a man with equal care. He told her he had ridden with the Army for 3 years before deciding he was more suited to law than to command. He did not tell her about the scar, and she still did not ask, but she noticed when he touched it sometimes without seeming to know he was doing it, the fingers of his left hand going briefly to his jaw in moments of uncertainty. She told him about her father's college, about the Cherokee student who had opened the door to something she had not known existed in herself, about arriving in Texas on a wagon that creaked in her husband's field journals, and the slow discovery that this particular country under its enormous sky had room for everything she was. "Do you miss Pennsylvania?" he asked one evening. She considered it honestly. "I miss my father," she said. "He died in 1876. I miss the particular shade of green that Pennsylvania has in June, the green that requires a great deal of rain to exist. I do not miss the smallness of the world there." She looked out the window at the darkness that held 100 miles of open country. "This is big enough for me." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. She filed it carefully and moved on. The crisis arrived without adequate warning, the way the most serious things tended to. One of Booth's men had been watching the barn. They had been less careful than they should have been on the second visit to document and inventory the stolen goods, and Booth's man had seen enough. Within 48 hours the word reached them through Maria Fuentes, breathless and frightened, that Booth was moving the goods. Not all of it, not on short notice, but enough to create reasonable doubt. And more dangerously, Booth had sent 3 men to find out who had talked. It was this last fact that brought Ezekiel to Lavinia's door at dawn, his horse still breathing hard, his expression carrying something new in it that took her a moment to identify as fear. Not fear for himself, fear for her. "You need to leave," he said. "Not permanently, but today. There are 3 men with motivation to find your sources and silence them, and your name will not stay out of this much longer." She looked at him carefully. "I am not leaving my land, Ezekiel." It was the first time she had used his given name. She saw him register it. "I am not asking as a marshal," he said, and his voice was lower. "I am asking as a man who does not want you hurt." The statement was precise and undecorated, and more affecting than any elaborate declaration would have been. She understood suddenly, with the clarity she usually reserved for linguistic analysis, that she had been moving toward this moment for 3 weeks, and that it was not a comfortable realization. She had not wanted to want anything from a man whose life was a succession of other territories, other warrants, other problems. She had built something here, something durable and rooted things did not travel well. "I will take precautions," she said carefully, "but I will not leave. If I leave, Maria Fuentes and the others have no anchor. The testimony we need falls apart. Booth knows that. It's why his men are looking." He stared at her for a long, taut moment. "Then I am staying here," he said, "on your property until this is resolved." She opened her mouth. "It is not negotiable, Miss Langley." He said it with a firmness that acknowledged her independence and overrode it anyway, not because he thought her incapable but because the situation required it and they both knew it. She closed her mouth. "There is a room in the back that was my husband's study," she said. "You may use it. Thank you. Do not touch the book collection. I would not dream of it." She turned away so he could not see her expression. The next 4 days were tense in 2 completely different registers simultaneously. The legal tension was the kind that built toward Ezekiel's deadline to present his warrant before the federal circuit judge who came through the territory on a schedule that allowed only a narrow window. The personal tension was quieter and more constant, and manifested in the particular awareness of another person's physical presence that Lavinia had not experienced in several years. He rose before her and had water heating before she came to the kitchen. She did not comment on this. He read in the evenings from whatever was available, and she caught him once reading one of Gerald's botanical texts with apparent genuine interest, and when she asked him about it, he said that his mother had kept a garden and he had always wanted to understand it better. She sat down and explained 3 things about prairie plant cycles that Gerald's text had gotten wrong, and Ezekiel listened and asked 3 intelligent follow-up questions. She realized, in a great deal of difficulty. The morning the trouble came was a cold gray morning that smelled like incoming weather. Lavinia was at the well when she heard horses. She counted 4, which was 2 more than she had expected, and the rhythm of the hooves said they were coming fast. She walked back to the house without running because running was information she did not want to give, and she said through the back door quietly and clearly, 4 riders coming from the northeast moving fast. Ezekiel was beside her in seconds. He looked through the window. 2 of Booth's men and 2 I don't know could be hired. "What do you need?" "I need the rifle over the mantel loaded, which I assume it already is." "It is always loaded," she said. "The shotgun under the kitchen bench is also loaded. There is a Navy Colt in the left drawer of the writing desk in the study, which was Gerald's and which I know how to use." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. "Of course you do. I grew up on a homestead," she said simply. "A woman alone on a homestead who doesn't know how to use her own guns is a woman who won't remain alive on a homestead." He wanted to say something. She could see it. He pressed it back and nodded. "I am going to go out and meet them. If I step back toward the house, that is your signal. Otherwise, stay inside." "I understand." He walked out onto the porch and she moved to the window where she could see and, if necessary, act. The riders came in and pulled up short at the sight of the badge. Booth's man, a lean, hard-faced individual named Stead, started talking first. He talked too loud and too fast and with too many gestures, and Lavinia, watching from the window, read the performance of it. He was stalling, looking around the property, looking for something. Then she understood. They were not here for her. They were here to find out if there was a witness on the property. They wanted to see if Maria was here. She moved quietly through the house to the back door and stepped outside and around the side of the building, to where she could hear the conversation more clearly. What she heard was Stead telling Ezekiel that Mr. Booth had simply come to check on his neighbor, that there had been a misunderstanding about some federal property, that surely the marshal could see there was nothing to worry about. And then she saw the 4th man dismounting quietly on the far side of the horses. She was back inside before he reached the window. She took the Navy Colt from the study drawer, checked it with the efficient habit of long practice, and went to the back of the house. The man trying to get in through the back door encountered the barrel of the Colt before he got the latch halfway open. "I would not," said Lavinia, in the calm voice she used for translating in high-tension situations. The man went very still. "Put your hands where I can see them and move away from the door," she said. "I'm not asking twice." He did. She kept him at gunpoint on the back porch, which required nothing from her except attention and composure, while Ezekiel dealt with the three men in front. She heard Ezekiel's voice rising. She heard another voice raised in argument. She heard the particular sound of Ezekiel's physical authority asserting itself, which she was coming to recognize. And then she heard the sound of horses leaving at significant speed. Ezekiel came around the house and stopped completely at the sight of her holding a grown man at gunpoint with a steadiness that made the man look deeply unhappy and her look entirely composed. He stared. "I have the fourth," she said. "He tried the back door. I assume you want him." Ezekiel crossed the space between the front and back of the house in about 4 large steps. He took the man by the collar and walked him to a fence post and secured him with impressive efficiency. Then he turned and looked at Lavinia, and he did something she had not seen him do before. He stood there and just looked at her for a full 5 seconds, and his expression was the most open it had ever been. Something in it that she felt like a physical thing. "You held a man at gunpoint," he said, "without my knowing you had even moved." "I had 3 seconds while your attention was at the front," she said. "I did not want him to have more than 3 seconds to think." "How long have you been able to do that?" "I have been managing emergencies alone for 3 years," she said. "I did not particularly want to, but I became adequate at it." He took a breath and let it out slowly. "You are remarkable," he said quietly, as if he had not intended to say it out loud. She felt the color come up in her face and was furious at it. "I am practical," she said. "Yes," he said, with something in his voice that was almost a smile. "You are the most practical, remarkable person I have ever encountered." The prisoner gave them Booth's schedule for moving the goods. He was not a particularly brave man once separated from his companions, and the information he provided was enough for Ezekiel to send a telegraph to the circuit judge and arrange for 2 additional deputy marshals to come up from the south. They arrived in 3 days. Grim-faced, capable men named Pinto and Dell, who looked at Lavinia with the particular wariness of men who had been told a woman was involved in a federal investigation and didn't know what to do with that information. They figured it out when they watched her translate a full deposition from Tassawi in 90 minutes without notes, and when she pulled out the written testimonies she had collected in 3 languages, organized and cross-referenced in a leather folio that would have done credit to a clerk's office. Pinto looked at Dell, and Dell looked at Pinto, and neither of them said anything unhelpful after that. Cyrus Booth was arrested on a Wednesday in early November, under a cold Texas sky, with the first real winter weather moving in from the north. Ezekiel executed the warrant personally, with Pinto and Dell flanking him, and Booth made the mistake of reaching for his desk drawer and found Ezekiel's hand on his wrist before the drawer had opened 2 inches. It was, by all accounts, Lavinia heard afterward, entirely efficient. The stolen goods were cataloged and logged in an official federal inventory. The process of returning them to the people they had been taken from would be slow and imperfect, because the government machinery that had allowed the theft was the same machinery that would oversee the restoration, and it did not move with either speed or apology, but it would move. The evidence was too complete and too carefully documented for anyone to bury it. Lavinia had made sure of that, and Ezekiel had made sure that her documentation was submitted in the form that a federal court required. Booth went south with Pinto and Dell and did not come back. The evening after the arrest, Lavinia stood in her kitchen and was aware of the particular quality of quiet that came after a sustained period of tension, the way the world seemed to settle back into its ordinary dimensions. She made coffee and brought 2 cups to the front room and set one in front of Ezekiel without asking if he wanted it, because she had been making him coffee for 3 weeks and it had become a known quantity. "You will leave soon," she said, not a question, a practical statement made in advance of the fact. He looked at the coffee cup. "Yes," he said. "The circuit judge wants a deposition in person. Then there is a situation in New Mexico that has been waiting." "Of course." She sat down. She drank her coffee. She was very composed. He was looking at her with that expression again, the open one. "There is a question I want to ask you," he said, "and I am aware that asking it may be presumptuous given the nature of our acquaintance." She looked at him directly, which she did with most things. "Then ask it. Do you want more than this?" he said. "More than this land, this solitary life? Or is this exactly what you have chosen and chosen deliberately, and I am about to embarrass myself significantly?" The bluntness of it surprised her into a breath of something that was almost a laugh. She pressed it back. "I did choose this deliberately," she said, slowly and honestly. 3 years ago I chose it because it was real and I could sustain it, and it did not depend on another person to maintain. I was not sure I could trust another person to be permanent." She set down her coffee cup. "I am less certain about some of those conclusions than I was 3 weeks ago." His hands on the table moved very slightly toward hers. "I have a record," he said, "of being permanent. 14 years in the same federal district, the same job, the same commitment to the same thing. I am not a man who leaves things unfinished." She looked at his hands and then at his face. "This territory is your territory, Ezekiel," she said. "You have a case in New Mexico. You have a job that takes you across 400 miles of hard country." "That is true," he said. "It is also true that Haskell County is within my district, that I have had no fixed base of operations for 3 years, that the Comanche situation on this reservation boundary is going to require ongoing federal attention and documentation for at least the next year, which will require an interpreter of genuine skill, not one of Calhoun's liturgical approximations." He paused. "I am making a practical argument." "You are making a terrible practical argument," she said, "and dressing it in practical language." "Yes," he said simply, "I am." The silence between them was full, not empty. She could feel the weight of it on her sternum, the specific gravity of something real and large being decided. She had been afraid of this, not of him, but of wanting. Wanting was a vulnerability she had managed very carefully since Gerald's death. And before that, honestly, since she had been old enough to understand that her particular combination of intelligence and independence did not conform to what most people expected of a woman, and that most men found this confusing or threatening or both. She had stopped waiting to be understood and had simply proceeded on her own terms. She had not expected to find a man who looked at her competence and her strength and her directness and responded with something that looked, unmistakably, like admiration. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a woman who will become smaller to make another person more comfortable. I have languages and skills and opinions, and I will use all of them. I will not defer to anyone on matters of my own judgment simply because that is what is expected." "I know that," he said. "It is one of several reasons I am sitting at this table having this conversation instead of riding south." She looked at his hands on the table, the careful, large hands that had moved through her house without disturbing anything, that had held a warrant with the same grip they had probably held a rifle. She reached across and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. "New Mexico first," she said. "You have a job." "Yes." "And then you come back." "Yes. We will see how it goes from there." He raised her hand and held it against his jaw for a moment, against that scar she had not asked about, and she felt the warmth of his skin and the roughness of it and the deliberate tenderness of the gesture. "What happened here?" she asked, finally, about the scar. "A man in Dodge City in 1878 who thought a knife was a better argument than words," he said. "He was wrong. Most people who choose knives over words are," she said. "You have some experience with that," he said, with a look that meant the warrior and the knife at her throat and the 6 words she had spoken that had changed everything. "I have found," she said, "that the right words in the right language will accomplish more than almost any other tool available to a person." He smiled. A full one. It changed his face entirely, and she was deeply glad to see it. "I believe you," he said. He left the following morning as the early November sun came pale and flat over the Texas plains. He shook her hand at the gate, which was the appropriate gesture for the level of acknowledged feeling between them and satisfied neither of them. He rode south with his evidence files and his leather notebook and the list of witness names she had compiled, and she watched him until the prairie swallowed him and stood for a moment in the cold air before going back to her work. There was a great deal of work. There always was. The homestead did not sustain itself. But she found herself in the following weeks making small adjustments to the study where Ezekiel had slept. Not large ones. She did not move anything of substance. But she cleared a space on the second shelf of the bookcase that faced the window, because a man who read botanical texts with genuine interest would have his own books, and they would need somewhere to go. The letters came with the mail rider who passed through every 2 weeks, and they were not love letters in the conventional sense, because neither of them was conventional. They were careful, honest, detailed accounts of what was happening, with observations and reactions woven through them in the way that thoughts weave through any honest correspondence. He wrote about New Mexico, about a land dispute involving a water source that had been diverted, which made her write back about the Comanche Creek situation and the pattern she was seeing. Because when something is unjust, it tends to be unjust in the same ways in multiple places. He wrote about a conversation he had had with a Navajo elder through a terrible interpreter, and his frustration at information lost in translation. She wrote back a primer on the basics of Navajo phonology with a list of the 3 common errors Anglophone speakers made. He wrote back that he had memorized the list. She smiled at that letter for longer than was strictly appropriate. He came back in January, on a gray, cold afternoon with ice in the wind, and she heard the hoofbeats from inside the house and knew them. She did not run to the window. She set down the letter she was translating for a Norwegian family who needed it rendered into Spanish for a land registry filing, and she stood up and walked to the door and opened it. He was coming through the gate. She stood on the porch and he rode up and dismounted and looked at her across the space of the yard, and they regarded each other for a moment in the cold winter light. "New Mexico is resolved," he said. "I heard," she said. "The telegraph ran a notice. I am reassigned to this district." "I know, Mr. Delacroix at the trading post told me 4 days ago." She paused. "I figured you'd eventually follow the directions." He recognized the echo of their first conversation. His mouth curved. "Miss Langley," he said, carefully and formally, "I would like to request the use of your front room for a conversation I have been composing since approximately Albuquerque." "It is cold," she said. "Come inside." The conversation, which had presumably been composed since Albuquerque, was brief and direct, and said everything that needed to be said. He was not a man who spoke in circles. Neither was she. They arrived at the center of the thing inside of 5 minutes, and then sat for a while in the simple fact of it, which was that they both wanted the same thing and were both, at this point, willing to say so clearly. He asked her properly, that evening after supper, kneeling on her flagstone kitchen floor with the kind of seriousness that was in everything he did. He had a ring that had been his grandmother's, plain silver, because he knew her well enough by then to know that plain silver was exactly right. She said yes, without hesitation, without qualification. She had calculated the odds of a man like Ezekiel Ralston appearing in her life, and she had arrived at a number that was very small, and she was a practical woman who knew how to value something rare. They were married in February of 1883, in Seymour, in a ceremony that was witnessed by a Quaker minister who drove 40 miles in bad weather because Lavinia had written him a letter, by Maria Fuentes and her husband who came dressed in their finest, by a Comanche woman named Tosa Wei, who had been one of Lavinia's first and most steadfast friends in the territory, and who brought a gift of beaded work that Lavinia would keep on her writing desk for the rest of her life, and by deputies Pinto and Dell who had come up from Fort Griffin, because Ezekiel had ridden with both of them for years, and they wanted to see it. Pinto cried at the ceremony, which Dell spent considerable energy pretending had not happened. They came back to the Haskell County homestead, which became what it had been on the verge of becoming, a home for two people instead of one, with the adjustments and negotiations that required, most of which were easier than either of them had privately feared. He had his books. They fit on the second shelf she had cleared, and there was still room for more. She had her languages and her work, which did not stop simply because she was married. The Comanche situation on the reservation boundary continued to require attention and documentation. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, chastened by the Booth scandal, appointed a new agent who was at minimum honest, and Lavinia served as an informal liaison for the first difficult year, while the new agent established trust that his predecessor had destroyed. She was not paid for this work in any official capacity, which was an injustice she noted with considerable directness in correspondence to the Bureau, letters composed with the precision of a woman who knew that the most effective anger was grammatically impeccable. Ezekiel signed them with her. The Bureau did not pay her. The Bureau rarely did anything as sensible as paying people who deserved it. But they listened, eventually, because the documentation she produced was too good to ignore, and the relationships she had built were too valuable to dismiss. Ezekiel's work continued to take him out of the county on circuits, sometimes for 2 weeks at a time, sometimes for a month. She had told him she could manage it, and she had been honest. She did manage it. The homestead ran, the correspondence continued. The translating work that families in the territory brought to her door kept her in useful occupation and small income. She had expanded her kitchen garden and added a second milk cow and kept a meticulous account book that would have made her Quaker father proud. When he came back from circuits, she always heard the hoofbeats and she always knew them, and she met him at the door not because it was required, but because it was the specific pleasure of recognizing something you have chosen deliberately and chosen well. She told him about Tassawi's granddaughter, who was learning to read English from a primer Lavinia had adapted to use Comanche sentence structures as reference points. He told her about a court case in Abilene where a Spanish-speaking witness had no interpreter and the judge had almost dismissed the testimony, and how Ezekiel had ridden through the night to find one, remembering what it felt like not to have Lavinia beside him in exactly that kind of situation. "You could have telegraphed me," she said. "You are not a telegraph resource," he said, mildly offended on her behalf. "You are my wife." She loved him most, she thought, in the moments when he said completely uncomplicated things like that. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was carrying their child. She told him in the morning over coffee, in the same matter-of-fact way she told him most things, and he set down his cup and was very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her, his arms around her carefully and with a tenderness that was at odds with everything about his physical presence, the way it always was, this large, capable man who was so gentle with the things that mattered. "All right?" he asked, against her hair. "More than all right," she said. "I am healthy and practical, and I have delivered approximately a dozen babies in this territory for other women. I know what to do." He laughed, pressed against her hair, and she felt the laughter in his chest and was deeply content. The boy was born in October, on a night that was cold and clear, attended by Maria Fuentes, who knew what she was doing, and by Tosa Way, who sat in the front room and prayed in the way of her people, and whose presence Lavinia had requested specifically because she had wanted it. Ezekiel paced the length of the front porch approximately 40 times, and then came inside because he could not sustain the pacing and the cold simultaneously. They named the son Samuel James Ralston, after Lavinia's father and Ezekiel's older brother who had died young. Samuel was a large and healthy and very vocal child from his first hour, which Ezekiel took as evidence of her influence, and she took as evidence of his, and they were probably both correct. The investigation's legacy settled into permanence over the following years in the way that genuine change, when it happens, tends to. The new reservation agent, a man named Hartley who actually spoke passable Comanche by his second year because Lavinia had taught him, rebuilt the supply chain under federal oversight with Ezekiel's continued audit attention. The creek was partly restored through an argument Lavinia made in writing to the Army Corps of Engineers that was so technically precise and legally articulated that it took the Corps 14 months to find a basis to decline it, and when they did she wrote back rebutting every point. The creek restoration was approved in 1885. Tassawi sent her a formal gift through the channels of honor his people used for people they considered worthy of it, and she received it with the gratitude and care it deserved. Life on the frontier in the 1880s was not simple or easy or without grief. There were bad winters and difficult seasons, and there was a summer of 1886 that brought drought and the loss of one of the crops, and a month of anxious calculation over the account books. There was the death of old Delacroix at the trading post in 1887, who had been the first person to send the marshal to Lavinia's door, and who had kept a rough and reliable kind of faith with everyone in the county for 30 years. There were 2 more pregnancies, a daughter named Frances in 1887 and another son named William in 1889, both healthy and both as strong-willed as their parents in ways that were simultaneously gratifying and exhausting. There was also love. Consistent, daily, real love of the kind that did not announce itself constantly, but that ran through everything like water through limestone, shaping things gradually into the forms they were always meant to take. She still woke before him most mornings and still had water heating before he came to the kitchen, because his route patrol sometimes went until late, and she knew what the extra hour of sleep meant. He still moved through her house, their house, with the same care he had shown from the first day, as if the things in it were worth treating with respect. He had learned over the years a working vocabulary of Comanche from her, not fluency. Not her fluency, which was a thing that could not be taught in any ordinary sense, but was built of years of immersion and an innate linguistic gift that Samuel appeared to be inheriting, to everyone's delight and some confusion, since the boy was 6 and already picking up Spanish from Maria's children, with an ease that made Lavinia feel a very specific joy. But Ezekiel had learned enough to greet people properly and to express the things that mattered most in a first conversation, which was intention and respect. Tassawi, when he met Ezekiel for the first time after the arrest and the restoration had begun, had listened to Ezekiel's careful Comanche greeting and then looked at Lavinia and said something. She had translated it, with a smile she could not contain. "He says your accent is terrible and your heart is good." Ezekiel had looked at Tassawi and said, carefully in Comanche, the phrase she had taught him for the specific purpose of this kind of moment, "I am still learning." Tassawi had nodded, with the expression of a man for whom this was an acceptable answer to most of life's problems. In the spring of 1890, 8 years after a federal marshal had ridden up to a homestead gate and found a woman repairing a wagon wheel, Lavinia sat at the kitchen table that had been the site of so many conversations and investigations and shared meals, and looked at a letter she had received from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She read it twice and then sat for a moment and then called to Ezekiel, who was in the yard with William, who was 18 months and had a strong preference for being carried on his father's shoulders. Ezekiel came in with William on his shoulders and William's fists in his hair, which he bore with the patience of a man who had been learning about patience from a remarkable woman for 8 years. "What is it?" he said, seeing her expression. She handed him the letter. He read it. His eyebrows went up. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, in its slow and imperfect way, had finally done something right. The letter was an official appointment, the first of its kind in this part of the territory. Lavinia Langley Ralston was being offered a paid position as an official federal interpreter and cultural liaison for the Southern Plains Reservation territories, a position that carried a federal salary, a formal title, and the authority to submit documentation directly to the Bureau without going through the local agent. It was not everything that was needed. It was not close to everything. The injustices built into the system ran too deep and too wide to be addressed by one appointment. She knew that, and she would not pretend otherwise. But it was real and it was formal, and it meant that the work she had been doing without recognition or compensation for 8 years was being acknowledged as work, as skilled and essential work, by the institution that had the most power over the territory she had chosen to call home. Ezekiel looked at her over the letter. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "You are going to take it," he said, not as a question. "Obviously," she said. He put William down on the kitchen floor, where the child immediately began investigating the table legs with the focused curiosity that characterized both his parents. And he crossed the room and took Lavinia's face in his hands with the gentle precision she knew as well as her own breath by now. He kissed her with the tenderness of a man who had been grateful every day for 3 years that he had ridden up to a homestead gate and been refused the comfort of easy explanations and been given instead something that required his best self and made everything worth it. "You are going to do remarkable things with this," he said when they were both steady. "We are," she corrected him. He smiled, the full one that still changed his face entirely. "We are," he agreed. Samuel, who was 6 and had been listening from the hallway with the alert patience of a child who understood more than expected, came into the kitchen and looked at both his parents and then said, in the Spanish he had been practicing with Maria's children, "Are we celebrating something?" Lavinia looked at Ezekiel. Ezekiel looked at Lavinia. "Yes," she said in Spanish, and then in English, and then in the Comanche she had been teaching him since he was old enough to sit still for it. "We are." The years that followed were full in the way that lives are full when they are genuinely lived, and not simply endured. Samuel grew into a boy who had his mother's gift for language and his father's gift for reading a room, a combination that was going to be useful and possibly dangerous in roughly equal measure. Frances had opinions about everything and expressed them clearly, which her father thought was excellent, and her mother thought was a form of karmic return. William, the youngest, was the steadiest and most patient of the 3, sitting through his mother's translation sessions with a quiet attention that made Lavinia think he would be a good listener when he grew up. Lavinia's work as the official federal liaison changed things in ways both large and small. The documentation she produced established standards and practices that other interpreters in other territories would eventually reference, though she did not know that yet. The relationships she had built and continued to tend became the foundation of something slower and harder, and more necessary than dramatic intervention, which was the ordinary daily work of being trustworthy across lines that the world kept trying to make uncrossable. She did this work without romance and without self-congratulation, in the straightforward manner that was her nature, and its effects compounded over time the way all consistent, honest work does. Ezekiel remained the federal marshal for the district for 16 more years, until his knees and a complicated horse incident in the winter of 1898 suggested that a man his age might reasonably allow younger men to take on the rougher circuits. He did not stop working. He became the county judge in Haskell County, a position that suited him entirely, because it was still the work of distinguishing truth from dishonesty. It simply required less riding and more sitting, which his knees appreciated. The homestead grew. The house grew with it, a room added when Samuel was 8 and another when Frances arrived, and a proper study for Lavinia that Ezekiel built himself over 2 summers with help from the Norwegian family who had become as close as any family they had. The bookshelves in the study held volumes in 12 languages by the time it was finished, which was not a boast, simply an accounting of what was there and what it had taken to accumulate. On a warm evening in the fall of 1891, 9 years after Ezekiel Ralston had ridden up to her gate the first time, Lavinia sat on the front porch of a house that had always been hers, and was now theirs, and watched the Texas sky go from gold to rose to the particular deep purple that came before the stars. Ezekiel sat beside her in the other chair, and they were both quiet in the comfortable way of people who have long since established that silence between them is not empty. Samuel was inside, audibly attempting to teach Frances the Spanish word for moon and being corrected by Frances, who had her own ideas about pedagogy. William was asleep. "Do you remember," Lavinia said, "the first thing you said to me when you rode up?" He thought. "I asked how you knew I was law." "Before that," she said, "you said nothing. You just pulled up your horse and looked at me." He was quiet a moment. "I was recalibrating," he said. She looked at him. "Against what?" "Against what I was expecting," he said, "and what was actually there." He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had that first evening at the table, turning his hand so hers rested in his palm. "I had built a picture in my mind of who I was going to find at the end of that fence line, and everything about it was wrong. Everything about what was actually there was better than anything I had imagined." She looked at the horizon, her fingers laced through his. "You were sitting on the fence post for about 10 seconds before you said anything," she said. "I was wondering if you were going to faint." He made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. "I was not going to faint. I was thinking very quickly." "About what?" He looked at her. In the evening light, with his hair fully silver now at the temples and that jaw she knew better than her own reflection, he looked at her with the expression she had spent years loving, the open one. "About whether the regulations about marshals maintaining professional distance applied as immediately as I was going to need them to," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a full and genuine laugh that she did not press back or turn away, and it carried out into the October evening over the plains that had been her home for 17 years, over the kitchen garden that was still producing in the October chill, over the fence she had rebuilt 3 times, and maintained 100 more, over the country that had room for everything she was, and everything he was, and everything they had made together. He watched her laugh, and his hand was warm in hers, and the stars began to come out over Texas one by one, in the enormous reliable sky that had been there before them and would be there long after, holding all the country and all the voices and all the languages in which people had found their way to the things that mattered most. She had told him, a long time ago, that the right words in the right language would accomplish more than almost any other tool available to a person. What she had not told him, because she had not known it yet, was that there was one language that had no alphabet and no grammar and no vocabulary that could be formally recorded, that was spoken in the particular way 2 people held hands on a front porch as the sun went down on a life they had built together, honestly and deliberately out of everything that was real. She knew it now. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. The plains went quiet around them, full of the sounds that prairies make at evening, the wind in the grass, the distant movement of cattle, the thin voices of her children inside the house that had become, over the years, the most important place in the world. Samuel's voice, already shading toward the low register he would carry as a man, insisting on something. Frances's voice, equal in certainty, insisting back. The small particular night sounds of a home where people live and argue and love and grow. Lavinia Ralston, who had once been Lavinia Langley, who had grown up in Pennsylvania with a father who believed language was the fundamental technology of civilization, who had crossed half a continent with a botanist's notebooks, and arrived at a stretch of Texas plain that had room for everything she was, looked at the country she had chosen, and the man she had chosen and the life she had built from both, and she found that she had no improvements to suggest. The night settled in around the Ralston homestead, full and close and warm against the October cold, and the stars came out over Haskell County in their thousands, as they had every night before and would every night after, indifferent and generous all at once. Everything was exactly as it should be.